John Calvin, born on the 10th of July, 1509 in France, and died on the 27th of May, 1564, was a French theologian, pastor, and reformer in Geneva during the Protestant Reformation. He became one of the most influential figures of this movement and played a central role in shaping the theological system later known as Calvinism. His teachings emphasized the doctrines of predestination and the absolute sovereignty of God in the salvation of humanity. These ideas were rooted in earlier Christian traditions, particularly those of Augustine, and were later expanded into a distinct theological framework. Through Reformed movements such as Presbyterianism, Congregationalism, the Waldensians, Calvinist Methodism, and Reformed Anglican churches, his influence spread across Europe and the wider world. Calvin was an energetic writer and controversial thinker, producing polemical works as well as writings in defense of his beliefs. He maintained strong correspondence with other reformers, including Philip Melanchthon and Heinrich Bullinger, offering both intellectual support and cooperation. His most important work, Institutes of the Christian Religion, laid the foundation for Protestant theology, and he also wrote commentaries on most of the books of the Bible, as well as numerous theological essays and confessional statements. Trained originally as a humanist lawyer, Calvin distanced himself from the Roman Catholic Church around 1530 during a time of growing persecution of Protestants in France. Seeking safety, he fled to Basel in Switzerland, where in 1536 he published the first edition of the Institutes. That same year, he was persuaded by William Farel to join the Reformation efforts in Geneva. Calvin began preaching regularly, but the city council resisted the strict reforms he and Farel sought to introduce, resulting in their expulsion. He then moved to Strasbourg at the invitation of Martin Bucer, becoming minister to a church of French refugees while maintaining ties with Geneva. In 1541, the city called him back, and this time he was able to establish his reforms more securely. During his leadership in Geneva, Calvin reorganized church government and created a new style of liturgy, though not without facing resistance from influential families who sought to limit his power. The most dramatic episode of his tenure was the trial and execution of Michael Servetus, a Spaniard accused of heresy for his views on the Trinity. Though the city council carried out the sentence, Calvin strongly supported his condemnation. With the arrival of new Protestant refugees and changes in the city council, his authority grew stronger, and his opponents were eventually removed from power. Calvin spent his final years consolidating the Reformation in Geneva and extending its influence throughout Europe. His writings and reforms left a lasting mark on Christian theology and church organization, making him one of the most important leaders of the Protestant movement. John Calvin, born as Jehan Cauvin on the 10th of July 1509 in Noyon, a town in Picardy in the Kingdom of France, was the second of 3 sons who survived infancy. His mother, Jeanne Lefranc, the daughter of an innkeeper from Cambrai, died during his childhood after giving birth to several more children. His father, Gérard Cauvin, had a respected career as cathedral notary and registrar to the ecclesiastical court. Gérard intended that his surviving sons, Charles, Jean, and Antoine, should all become priests. From an early age, Calvin showed unusual intelligence. At only 12, he was employed by the bishop as a clerk and received the tonsure, marking his dedication to the church. He came under the patronage of the powerful Montmort family, which enabled him to attend the Collège de la Marche in Paris, where he studied Latin under the renowned teacher Mathurin Cordier. Later, he moved on to the Collège de Montaigu, as a philosophy student. In the mid-1520s, Gérard redirected his son's path from theology to law, believing a legal career would be more lucrative. Calvin enrolled at the University of Orléans to study law, and by 1529, he was continuing his studies at the University of Bourges, where he came under the influence of the humanist lawyer Andreas Alciati. Humanism emphasized a return to classical learning, and during this period, Calvin also studied Koine Greek, essential for reading the New Testament in its original form. The timing of Calvin's religious conversion remains debated. Some place it around 1533, just before he resigned from his church post, while others argue it occurred earlier, in 1529 or 1530. In his writings, Calvin described his conversion in two ways. In one account, he wrote of a sudden transformation by God that turned his hardened mind toward faith. In another, he portrayed it as a long struggle filled with spiritual anguish before he surrendered to divine grace. Despite differences in detail, both accounts mark his eventual break with the Roman Catholic Church. By 1532, Calvin had earned his law degree and published his first book, a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia. Returning to Paris, he found the university climate tense, with reform-minded humanists clashing with conservative faculty. His friend Nicholas Kopp, the rector of the university, delivered a bold inaugural address calling for reform in the Catholic Church. The address was denounced as heretical, and Kopp was forced to flee. Calvin, closely associated with him, was implicated and went into hiding, moving between Paris, Angoulême, Noyon, and Orléans. The danger intensified in 1534 during the affair of the placards, when anti-Catholic posters appeared in French cities, provoking violent reprisals against reformers and their sympathizers. With his position untenable, Calvin fled France. In January 1535, he reached Basel, joining Kopp in a city that had long been influenced by the reformer Johannes Oecolampadius. This marked the beginning of Calvin's new life as a Protestant reformer in exile. In March 1536, John Calvin published the first edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion. This book served both as a defense of the Reformed faith and as an introduction for those seeking to understand Christianity. It was his first systematic presentation of theology, and he revised and expanded it throughout his life. Soon after the book appeared, Calvin traveled to Ferrara in Italy, where he briefly worked as secretary to Princess Renée of France. By June, he was back in Paris with his brother Antoine, who was handling their late father's affairs. However, after the Edict of Coucy offered heretics 6 months to return to the Catholic faith, Calvin realized his future in France was impossible. In August 1536, he set out for Strasbourg, a free imperial city of the Holy Roman Empire, known as a haven for reformers. Military movements of imperial and French forces forced him to take a southern route, which unexpectedly brought him to Geneva. Calvin planned to stay only one night, but the reformer William Farel urged him passionately to remain and help with the reform of the city's church. Persuaded by Farel's plea, Calvin accepted, taking up duties without clearly defined responsibilities. Eventually, he received the title of Reader, which allowed him to give lectures on the Bible. In October, he took part in the disputation at Lausanne to persuade the city toward Protestantism. By 1537, Calvin had been chosen as a pastor, though he never underwent formal consecration. For the first time, the young lawyer theologian was performing pastoral duties such as baptisms, weddings, and leading worship. That same year, Farel and Calvin presented to Geneva's City Council a set of articles detailing church organization and worship. These articles outlined the celebration of the Eucharist, the practice of excommunication, the requirement for citizens to subscribe to a confession of faith, the introduction of congregational singing, and revisions to marriage laws. The council accepted these proposals. Despite this initial success, Calvin and Farel soon faced resistance. Most citizens refused to subscribe to the confession of faith, and the council grew uneasy with the ministers' insistence. Their French origins also raised suspicions, as Geneva considered an alliance with France. Tensions peaked when Béarn, Geneva's ally in church reform, pushed for uniformity in worship practices, including the use of unleavened bread for the Eucharist. Calvin and Farel resisted, insisting the matter should be decided at a synod in Zurich. When the council ordered them to comply, they refused to administer communion at Easter, sparking a riot. The council then ordered both men to leave the city. Calvin and Farel traveled to Bern and Zurich to defend themselves. A synod in Zurich placed much of the blame on Calvin, criticizing his lack of sensitivity to Geneva's people. Though Bern attempted to mediate, Geneva's council refused to reinstate them. Farel eventually moved to Neuchâtel, while Calvin accepted an invitation from Martin Bucer and Wolfgang Capito to serve the Church of French Refugees in Strasbourg. At first, Calvin hesitated, wishing Farel could join him, but he relented after Bucer's persuasion. By September 1538, Calvin had settled in Strasbourg, convinced that this time his ministry would be permanent, and within months he was granted citizenship in the city. During his years in Strasbourg, John Calvin did not serve in a single church, but successively ministered in Saint-Nicolas, Sainte-Madeleine, and the former Dominican church known as the Temple Neuf. He preached daily, with 2 sermons on Sundays, served a congregation of around 400 to 500, and emphasized monthly communion and the singing of psalms. During this period, he also began revising his Institutes of the Christian Religion, dissatisfied with its original catechetical structure. The new edition, published in 1539, expanded from 6 to 17 chapters and presented theology in a more systematic form. At the same time, he wrote his commentary on Romans, which became the model for his later biblical commentaries. Calvin's friends encouraged him to marry, but he approached marriage pragmatically, stating that if he did take a wife, it would be to free himself from worries so he could serve God better. He rejected several proposals, including one with a noblewoman, before marrying Idelette de Boer in 1540, a widow with 2 children. Meanwhile, conditions in Geneva had changed since Calvin's expulsion. Church attendance had fallen, political tensions with Béarn were rising, and a letter from Cardinal Jacopo Sadoleto invited Geneva to return to Catholicism. The council turned to Calvin for a reply, and his letter to Sadoleto forcefully defended the Reformation in Geneva. Though Calvin initially dreaded returning, Strasbourg eventually agreed to lend him back to Geneva in 1541, and he re-entered the city that September with his family. Soon after, Calvin introduced his ecclesiastical ordinances, which the council approved in November 1541. These reforms established 4 offices in the church: pastors, doctors, elders, and deacons, and created the consistory, a church court to oversee discipline. Although the consistory had authority in spiritual matters, the government retained civil jurisdiction, including the power to impose sentences. In 1542, Calvin published The Form of Prayers and Church Hymns, adapting a Strasbourg service book and adding psalms by Clément Marot himself, and later contributions from Louis Bourgeois. That same year, he issued a revised catechism of the Church of Geneva, reorganizing its structure around faith, law, and prayer. Calvin preached tirelessly, delivering more than 2,000 sermons during his ministry in Geneva. He worked methodically through books of the Bible, often preaching for over an hour without notes. From 1555 to 1556, for example, he gave 200 sermons on Deuteronomy. His sermons were later recorded by Denis Raguenier, who developed a shorthand system to preserve them. In his private life, Calvin endured personal sorrow. In 1542, his wife Idelette gave birth to a son, Jacques, who died shortly after birth. Idelette herself died in 1549, and Calvin never remarried. He described her as his most faithful companion, who would have shared both poverty and death by his side. Despite his strict reforms, criticized by Voltaire and others as austere, Calvin maintained enduring friendships with figures like Mathurin Cordier, Nicolas Cop, William Farel, Philip Melanchthon, and Heinrich Bullinger. His household was modest, owned by the council, and shared with his brother Antoine's family and several servants. Throughout his leadership in Geneva, Calvin remained a powerful force in shaping the Reformation, both in the city and across Europe. In Geneva, John Calvin faced fierce opposition, particularly from a faction he labeled the Libertines. These were wealthy and politically influential families who rejected both church and civic discipline, claiming that grace freed them from such obligations. Conflicts quickly became personal. Pierre Ameau publicly insulted Calvin. Ami Perrin, who had once brought Calvin to Geneva, turned against him, and the Libertines often disrupted church life by mocking ministers and breaking moral laws. In 1547, Jacques Gruet, a sympathizer of the group, was arrested after leaving a threatening letter in Calvin's pulpit. Under torture, he confessed and was executed, with Calvin supporting the decision. By the early 1550s, the Libertines controlled much of Geneva's council, and Calvin's position seemed precarious. In 1552, Perrin was elected first syndic, and Calvin even offered his resignation, though it was refused. The turning point came in 1553 with the trial of Michael Servetus, a Spanish physician and theologian who denied the Trinity and predestination. Servetus had previously exchanged heated letters with Calvin, even sending back a heavily annotated copy of Institutes criticizing his theology. When Servetus was captured in Geneva, he was tried for heresy. Despite libertine hopes of using the case against Calvin, all of Europe's reformed cities condemned Servetus, and the Geneva Council sentenced him to death. He was burned at the stake on 27 October 1553. Although Calvin and other ministers reportedly requested a less brutal execution, their plea was denied. The trial elevated Calvin's reputation as a defender of orthodoxy, but disputes over church authority continued. A central issue was whether the consistory, the church's disciplinary court, had the right to excommunicate. The council had tried to reserve this authority for itself, but after much debate, the Swiss churches ruled in favor of Calvin in 1555, restoring the consistory's powers. That same year, the Libertines attempted a final revolt. Following the February elections, which gave Calvin supporters control of the council, Perrin and his allies incited riots. They tried to lead a coup, but the uprising quickly collapsed. Perrin fled, and other leaders were executed. With their defeat, Calvin's authority in Geneva was secured, and his church reforms could proceed without serious opposition. This victory firmly established Geneva as a stronghold of the Reformation under his leadership. In his final years, John Calvin's authority in Geneva was virtually uncontested, and he was recognized across Europe as a reformer distinct from Martin Luther. Although Luther and Calvin initially respected one another, their disagreements on the Eucharist eventually placed Calvin closer to Zwingli's symbolic interpretation. Calvin lamented the disunity among reformers, but sought reconciliation, signing the Consensus Tigurinus with Heinrich Bullinger and supporting Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's call for an ecumenical synod, though it never materialized. Geneva became a haven for Protestant exiles, most notably the Marian exiles from England, who established their own church under John Knox and William Whittingham, and later carried Calvin's doctrines back to Britain. Calvin also turned his attention to education. In 1559, he oversaw the creation of a new school in Geneva, the College for Grammar Studies and the Académie for Advanced Instruction. Theodore Beza was appointed rector, and within a few years, the school was flourishing with hundreds of students. The college evolved into today's College Calvin, while the academy became the University of Geneva. Throughout the 1550s, Calvin devoted immense energy to supporting the Protestant cause in France. He supplied theological writings, liturgy, and moral direction, while also sending over 100 trained ministers across the border. Despite severe persecution under King Henry II, the French Reformation gained momentum under Calvin's guidance, though Geneva officially disclaimed responsibility when confronted by French authorities. By the end of the decade, Calvin's health was deteriorating. He suffered from fever, violent coughing fits, and eventually burst a blood vessel in his lungs. Still, he worked tirelessly to finish the final and greatly expanded edition of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, now 4 books with 80 chapters. In April 1564, he dictated his will and delivered a final farewell to Geneva's ministers, recounting his life's trials and achievements. On 27th May 1564, he died at the age of 54. To avoid any cult of veneration, he was buried in an unmarked grave in Geneva's cemetery, the precise location still unknown. Calvin's theology, systematized in the Institutes, emphasized the knowledge of God and self as the foundation of wisdom. He taught that Scripture was self-authenticating and essential for knowing God, that human nature was corrupted by original sin, and that salvation was entirely God's work. Justification was by faith alone, achieved through union with Christ by the Spirit, and sustained by the sacraments of baptism and the Lord's Supper. He defended the doctrines of election and double predestination, acknowledging their harshness but affirming them as divine truth. His ecclesiology stressed the true church as the community of believers under Christ's headship, not under papal authority. He recognized only 2 permanent offices, pastors and doctors, and 2 sacraments, baptism and the Lord's Supper, rejecting Catholic and Lutheran views of the Eucharist. For Calvin, the supper was not mere symbolism, but a mystery where faith was nourished by the Spirit. Calvin's ideas were not without controversy. He was accused of Arianism by Pierre Caroli, attacked over predestination by Jérôme Hermès Bolsec, and fiercely opposed by Joachim Westphal on the Eucharist. He clashed with Justus Velsius over free will and with Sebastian Castellio, who broke with him after the execution of Servetus, advocating tolerance instead of doctrinal severity. His views on Jews and Judaism remain debated. Some scholars argue he was less hostile than Luther, while others place him firmly within the anti-Semitic tradition of his time. He upheld the continuity of God's covenant but considered contemporary Jews as a rejected people until they embraced Christ. His only dedicated treatise on the subject argued that Jews misinterpreted their own scriptures by failing to see the unity of Old and New Testaments. By the time of his death, Calvin had left an enduring mark not only on Geneva, but on Protestantism worldwide. His writings, institutions, and theological system shaped Reformed churches across Europe and beyond, ensuring that his legacy would outlive the fierce struggles of his own lifetime.